what's going on? I am Travis with Proselytize or Apostatize, and we have a really cool show today. As a matter of fact, for February, we're doing guest host month, where like former debaters and guests we've had on the show actually take over the moderator's job. And so, interestingly, today we have both a moderator and a debater, and he is the Faithiest Atheist. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and give it over to you, Mr. Faithiest Atheist.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Travis. I'm Richard. I have a Facebook page called The Faithiest Atheist. And I'm just going to ask everybody else on the panel to just introduce who they are, and then I'll get into the topic. Does that work?
Yeah, sounds good. I guess I'll go ahead and start. And if I guess we're going to go with like me, Joshua, then James.
Yeah.
So I'm Travis. I'm actually one of the co-hosts of this podcast, but I'm working on the downhill side of finishing my Master's of Science in Atmospheric Science. So really looking forward to that. I'm also a member of the Reasons to Believe Apologetics community. So part of RTB, which is a science faith ministry that I'm really happy to be a part of. And yeah, just like looking forward to this really interesting conversation.
Joshua?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Joshua Sherman, and I host a podcast called Tending Our Nets. It's just really short episodes every week, just trying to help people that have grown up with a really maybe narrow view of the gospel to understand really more in historical context what the gospel meant, what we see throughout the narrative of Scripture, what it means to have faith in Christ, what salvation looks like, all of those kinds of things. Because I feel like a lot of times the conversations people end up having are so narrow that it's like, how do you engage with people when you're trying to encourage them to come to faith or to stay in faith in Christ? And so want to be able to do that effectively. And I feel like having a more well-rounded understanding really helps with that.
And James?
Yeah. Hey, happy to be back on the show. This is my fourth time on the show. I was just, reflecting earlier just how awesome this community is. So really happy to be here today. Also thought the introduction was extremely captivating there. So enjoying that music, but a little bit about me. I'm an ex-Christian, ex-pastor. I've studied theology, currently doing a master in other areas. Interesting. We're having a hypothetical conversation today. Looking forward to partnering with the Faithiest Atheist here today as my partner against these two fine gentlemen, and just really happy to be here, guys. And it's also 3 a.m. in Australia today, so but I've I'm showered, I've got up, I've done my routine, so I'm here and I'm present, and I've had a beer, so let's get this going. So
yeah, we're ready.
Okay, yeah, let's do this. And I just want to say I've always noticed the Honest Atheist. I've noticed that name for a while, and I've always hoped that we could be on a debate together. And just to warn the audience, he's the Honest Atheist. I'm the Faithiest Atheist. So at any point, I might lie. And then, and also, he might ask for evidence, but I won't, because I'm the Faithiest Atheist. So between the two of us, we might be okay. So this whole show started from a hypothetical conversation, and I was talking about how there's certain neurology and biology that shows that simple cells or simple living organisms move around without any nervous system. So they don't even have a brain, much less a nervous system, and yet they're doing things like avoiding danger, moving towards light in many cases. They're regulating temperatures. They're regulating various parts about their existence. And then they're replicating. At that point, if you're going to pass DNA on to future generations, at that level, you're replicating rather than requiring a mate. So I was thinking, are these simple cells? And before we get into it, I'll name 3 sources that anybody in the audience wants to look up. Just to kind of see for some examples about what we're talking about. But real quick, the book that kind of started all this for me, thinking down this road, is, I don't know if this shows up backwards or not, It's called the Deep History of Ourselves, and the author's name is Joseph Ledoux. The next one is 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she has another book called How Emotions Are Made. So like if you really want to get into the very specific examples of how simple cells are, all the different activities, like the Joseph Ledoux guy, he lists like all the different activities that these simple cells do, and these simple living organisms do without a brain or a nervous system. And then Lisa Feldman Barrett gives examples too, especially in terms of the development of the nervous system and then the brain. So the very beginning stages that, from her books go back 550 million years to like the very first things that seem to look like they're heading towards a nervous system and a brain without having that yet. And then there's also a guy named Seth Grant at the University of Edinburgh. And he doesn't have any books, but if you look up Seth Grant, University of Edinburgh, you'll see his research. But he talks about how it comes down to chemicals and protein shapes, those two things. So he says there's these cells and then there's these proteins within something like a synapse. So so at that point, there's not even a synapse yet, but there's these protein shapes that cause cells to move in certain different directions. So, in their research, they're already down to like the specific protein shape and things that are like synapses when they get down to why these things move in these certain directions. And so my question was, I try to be empathetic. I try to look at things from a theist approach or an atheist approach. And I was like, does this cause any problems or does this help? Either case, because if you're atheist, you could say, okay, checkmate. So now we know it's protein shapes and chemicals. Next, what's the next topic? And if you're a theist, you could say, well, isn't it amazing that these things happen even at that level? So you don't even have to ask if you need a brain or nervous system because you still have this amazing stuff going on even without a brain or nervous system. So I thought no matter what you believe or don't believe, this might be interesting. Could be challenging. It could support what you already think. And if it supports what we already think, then we can just talk about that. But I thought it would be a good topic for us all to discuss. I didn't plan on going first. I thought me giving the introduction would be our going first. Our side going first would just be me giving the introduction. So I don't know if Travis or Joshua want to go next.
Yeah, so I was kind of thinking about this. Is this more of like a hypothetical scenario, or is this like more like research into like a new understanding, or what's the context we're going to be kind of going with here?
For me, I was thinking the show is just whether if you're a theist to say, this troubles me, or this is exactly what I expected, and then if you're an atheist, same thing. Whether you have papers to cite or whether you've just been thinking about it philosophically or whatever. It's just, do you think this is a problem or do you think it should be a problem for the other side? Like if you think it's a checkmate for the other side, bring that up.
Well, so I haven't really thought about this whatsoever, nor prep for it. So I'm just going to kind of go off the top of my head. Some initial thoughts I have is going to kind of be going from the philosophy of science here. We look at number one, the fine tuning. I would bring the fine tuning up because, you have all these cosmic conditions, that produce the heavy elements in the nuclear furnace of stars. We need certain precisions and the constants for this. But specifically, I would get into also the local fine tuning because it's going to definitely trickle down there. Because, we have things like the precision in plate tectonics, volcanism, the atmospheric conditions, the oxygenation events. And you'll notice in, things like temperature is going to be what regulates and controls chemical reactions. Because, think of like water freezing and everything. And so we're going to need a precise set of conditions for this chemical process to get going. In fact, I'm even of the persuasion that the anthropic principle extends into biochemical systems. And so I'm also thinking, we have this phenomena in need of explanation. And so I think this is where we can kind of turn to the philosophy of science and look at, try and give an inference to the best explanation in light of theories, certain or hypothesis, theoretical virtues. And I'm thinking, if with these organisms, we see sort of an intentionality, goal direction, and aboutness. And I think the best explanation for that phenomena is going to be an intelligence and intentionality guiding the process, because we sort of have like a lower order good and then a higher order good that these organisms are going to be in contact with. And so I think, an intentionality behind the process. And so we look at virtues like, evidential accuracy. I think, theism, would fit the empirical evidence well. I think it's internally consistent. I mean, I don't see any contradictory aspects of it. I would look at simplicity. I think it's going to explain this phenomena better than naturalism with less theoretical content. And I think it's also going to offer a unification of other processes we see, various processes we see going on. We could even get into things like objective morality, applicability of mathematics, stuff like that. I think it would correlate everything well with an intention, with an intelligence and intentionality guiding the process. So I think it's fruitful in that aspect. And so I think basically theism would explain the data. It would offer the best explanation of the data. So we have plausible reason, abductively plausible reason to conclude theism would offer the best explanation.
Okay. And then I was thinking what we would do, like, rather than, immediately challenge each other or things like that. I was thinking both members of each side would go, and then we could all just do sort of a open dialogue. And rather than like trying to take exact turns, what I might do is this, after 20 minutes of me and Joshua talking and James hasn't said anything, I might just stop and say, okay, wait, let's James weigh in or something like that. Rather than everybody taking exactly 3 minutes. Does that sound okay?
That's great.
Yeah, you're the moderator, brother.
All right. So Joshua, what do you think at this point?
Oh man, this is one of those things where, I think about all the different like books on my shelf and the things I think about, and this is not one of the things that's usually on that list, right? So it's always fun to engage with things like this and to try to kind of approach them honestly. And I think the first thing that I think about when I look at this is just it seems like to me there are a couple of different kind of moving parts that are going on here when we're asking about what the implications might be, right? So one of them is how new is this information compared to what we know about the world in other ways, and how does it fit in with other things we know? So for instance, we can talk about the fact that you put a plant in a window and part of it's shaded and part of it's sunny, like you will see that plant moving towards the sun, right? So sometimes I think we think about this idea of volition and the mind, and then what has to be there for things to be able to respond to stimuli in ways that maybe are a little too anthropocentric, because we think that things need to be like us in order to do those things. Right. And to me, the illustration of a plant can do that makes me think, okay, maybe our conceptions are a little too simple when we just start out, before we start studying the science. Obviously, right. Once you guys are getting into the details of the science, you're looking at a much more detailed level. But I'm just kind of thinking those kind of big, things out here, right? So, okay, if plants can do that, oh, that's kind of interesting. If we're talking about biblical data, and then you start kind of asking those questions about what kind of worldview people had when they were writing books of the Bible, when they were thinking about these things, the language they used. And it's pretty clear that the viewpoint we have on exactly how anatomy works and how it interacts with the world is different than what they did. So on some level, you can have that meta question of like, well, does that mean that the Bible's inaccurate? Or does that mean that they're just thinking about these things in different terms and trying to deal with things, with the world around them in the way that they saw things, and express things that they're understanding about that, and express things about God. And one of the examples that I think is kind of interesting with that is you look at something like Matthew 9:36. Jesus sees the multitudes and he was moved with compassion for them, right? The word that's used there is basically like the equivalent of he spleened them, right? This is not how we think about this at all. We don't think about compassion and the spleen having any relationship to each other. So I already think there's kind of this sense of the way that we understand the mechanics of the world and the way that, you know, someone coming from kind of a biblical perspective looks at things. In a lot of ways, they're just different. And one of the things that says to me is, if I'm an honest Christian and I'm looking at the Bible and I see things like that, it seems to me that the mechanics of exactly how that seems to be explained in the Bible, maybe that's not meant to be scientific.
Right.
And maybe I don't need to try to read that level of detail into it. And when I look at things like the plant and I look at things like that, for me, that just, I look at it and I say, okay, another one, like our mind, our gut, they're connected somehow. We're starting to understand this, right? Your gut health can impact the way you're thinking and vice versa.
Right.
These are things we're only beginning to understand. And so to me, I don't think there's as much of this like one-to-one relationship with certain levels of responding to stimuli and things like that between what we think of as a brain and a nervous system and what's there, right? You know, so it seems like there's more to it than just this when we're talking about that level.
Absolutely.
Once we move beyond that, then we start getting into the questions of like, okay, at a higher level, when we're starting to talk about, you know, deeper levels of cognition, being able to, you know, have language, inference and logic. Those are the points when I think we start to get a little bit more towards like, this seems to happen up here, but does it happen up here mechanistically or not? We can have that conversation. So those are the big things that I'm tending to kind of just frame as I'm trying to even just evaluate how this kind of fits into how we see the world and whether it might fit with a theistic or atheistic perspective.
Okay. James, you want to kick in?
Yeah, sure. This is an interesting topic. I would preface everything as I say by saying this would not be my topic of choice. But because I like the community here, that's why I'm present today. But I'd like to go through just a couple of things I think I'm uncomfortable with in perhaps the theist approach to this,
sure,
rather than my own approach. So I'd firstly say I don't particularly, now I know this is meant to be a fun conversation, but I don't particularly appreciate hypothetical conversations. I'm more interested in talking about various evidences that are presented on both sides of the atheist and Christian debate and diving into those elements. So that's number one. Number two is I think we need to be very careful about the implementation of appointing intentionality towards any conversation relative to this. So in some ways, I wish I'd read those books that you're presenting now, Richard. They look really interesting. And I would also say, and this is my final point, that human beings are very good at projecting consciousness onto other animals or insects. And I think a good example of that would be something like we would tie in purpose with consciousness. So we would look at you would say, I don't know, a hive of bees, and say, oh wow, I mean they're you'd look at it and I don't know if anyone's a beekeeper. I'm certainly not, but I've seen enough to know that when you might watch a documentary on bees, and it's all about the queen, right? So like if you watch a documentary on bees, everyone's just waiting to see the queen bee and what the heck's going on there, and everything's described, in respect of the drones or the warrior bees protecting the queen, and then you'd have your general bees. I know that's probably not the right term, but their purpose is to serve the queen. So do you see already how I've and that is true, But what I've done there is I've described, in basic terms, the purpose of bees, and also what they're up to and what they're interested in doing. And you could even say of the queen, well, the queen, her purpose is to A, have servants, but B, produce an heir to that hive, a new queen. So I'm okay with that. Those things are true. But when we get down to this level, and what are we talking about here, Richard? Are we like what size of particle or subatom? Like what are we actually talking about here?
Well, I would say anything from that very first living organism that's actually moving towards energy and moving away from danger and regulating itself and replicating successfully. And in fact, the reason why the author wrote that book is he said once an organism starts doing all of these activities, that's where it's life. So he's actually saying these activities are the parameters in which you finally say, okay, now we're talking about life. So anything from that going up, you can talk about ant colonies, beehives, the plants that Joshua was just saying, moving towards the sunlight. That's this idea that I'm talking about. It seems to be, I'm not saying that it is intentionality, but the fact that we look at it that way, it's definitely an activity that leads towards its survival. And so does that?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
So I just wanted to get one more point before I lose it. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, partner. I would just say, just because there's something doesn't mean we have to. I mean, if we can't see the intentionality there, let's not go ahead and prescribe it. Okay, we don't have to do that.
Right.
And I would say, and I know we're not getting into debating our opponent's points as of yet, but I'm going to go ahead and start that.
This is honest. You're being very honest right now.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. That's why you're the honest atheist.
I think, Travis, by simply saying, in broader terms, this is the best explanation by providing, the theist concept, and that's, the Christian theist concept. This seems to be the best implementation. It confirms or affirms fine-tuning, etc. And I'm sure from, as Richard was saying earlier, from appreciating both perspectives, I can do that myself. Actually, look, it does seem to affirm the concept of fine-tuning. Not that I believe in the concept of fine-tuning,
right?
But I'm just I can appreciate that, but I'm also uncomfortable with doing that, and that's my 3 minutes.
Okay.
So did you want me to kind of like respond to some of that, or how do we?
Did Richard want to go into more detail, or is he having a turn? Or
yeah, I'm going to go real quick just because I did the introduction. But I'll just say that for me, I think that the fine tuning thing is something. It's certainly wild that things do work. It's just that the reason why I don't become a theist is that there's so many things that don't work, and it looks like in most cases most things don't work. So then I would say then it's just a whole bunch of chaos where it doesn't work, and then every so often it does. So that I'm like still amazed by the fine tuning, but not so amazed that I think that there's something guiding it. But especially here with all these simple organisms and plants and bees and wasps and all that, when it does work, that's fantastic. But then when it doesn't work, then I usually use the word amazing when I'm inspired. But then when when I'm not inspired, I'll say it's like mind-boggling. It's more, devastating might be too strong a word, but just kind of chaotic. So like one apologist, Greg Kokel, was talking about how ant colonies are just too amazing to not think that God is real. But then I'm thinking, what about when the ant colonies attack each other, or what about when they swarm into an ecosystem and destroy it? So it's not, sometimes they save it, but sometimes they destroy it. So there's just a bunch of stuff that doesn't work too. So the fine tuning thing is kind of why I went in towards atheism. But but still, here's these, and I guess when you get to ants, you're talking about nervous systems and brains too. But although they're simple, much more simple. But yeah, that's really my take for. I can understand fine tuning, but the why it doesn't push me into theism. But yeah, from there, Travis, you can respond to either of those.
Yeah. So as I'm kind of listening to both you and James, so one thing that's really important to distinguish is teleology. And, James was talking about consciousness, and, we want to make sure we don't project, our thoughts of or our concepts of intentionality onto like lower organisms and everything. And I agree. But that's not really what teleology is. Teleology is that these organisms are goal oriented and work towards their own good. So it's this concept of lower order goods. It's not consciousness or projection in the same way we would think. It's that the organisms work towards their own good, like the good of the organisms. So there's an aboutness to them working towards their own good, and so an inference to the best explanation was kind of that there's a higher order good controlling or guiding the processes or is behind the process. And with this idea of fine tuning, so I'm not claiming it's like deductive proof of theism. What I'm doing is I'm looking at this data, the data of like the necessary atmospheric conditions, plate tectonics, and all these processes we would need to get these chemical reactions and molecules bonding together in the first place. So why this process should even exist at all, why it functions in the way that it does, that it brings this about. And so I'm looking at that data and I'm saying, well, I'm not claiming it's, absolute proof of God. What I'm doing is I'm trying to offer the most simplest unifying explanation of the phenomena. And I think theism, which is an intelligence and intentionality that this should happen, offers the most simplest unifying explanation. And that one thing I really like about it is that it's not gonna have to tack on extra theoretical content to solve isolated problems and everything. And I think if we look at it from a naturalist perspective, a worry I would have is that we're gonna tack on these arbitrary limits to the explanation. So that's kind of my 2 cents on everything.
Okay. James, any thoughts on that?
I do have a couple. I was gonna suggest Josh add some more to that, or
let's
share his thoughts first. Or I'm happy to go.
So a couple of things, just responding to something James said earlier to clarify that may help kind of lead into this. I think it's interesting because we have this kind of question, I guess, and when we're talking about intentionality and consciousness, are we projecting the fact that it's there, and is that the issue? Or is it also, at least partly, we're projecting some kind of sense of what we think that consciousness must look like in other beings into that, right? So you think about some of the work of Thomas Nagel talking about, like, you don't know what it's like to be a bat, right? What we do when we try to do that is we take our consciousness and try to inject it theoretically into, now I have echolocation and I can fly and I like to eat bugs, right? But that tells us really nothing about the actual conscious experience and the processing that's going on inside that bat. So on some level, we could say that bat has intentionality to capture that food, to eat that food, to survive. But how exactly that looks when it's processing things and it's doing things is something that's like really hard for us to understand. And that's a fairly simple example. One of the things that gets kind of fun with theism on the flip side, and so I'll kind of come out and just say this: sometimes people try to take how we think and then apply it to God. And it's like, okay, if I can't understand the way that a bat actually experiences the world and the way that intentionality functions, how am I supposed to do that with a being that's far beyond my understanding, right? Like that gets really interesting and crazy. So on the one hand, that's kind of just that check, I think, for theists in terms of how much are we trying to basically just say with it we can know absolutely for sure versus saying, this is what we believe we understand. This is what we seem to think an experience of God, both positively and in terms of, well, God's not like this or not like that. So your apophatic and cataphatic theology working in concert. But then to the point at hand, are we projecting intentionality? And is that a problem? Is it specifically the kind of understanding we have of what that intentionality entails that may be possibly the bigger problem? It's just one of the questions that I have in my mind as I'm starting to think about that question.
Okay, James.
Yeah, sure. So I don't want this to be seen as a red herring in my response, but one of so we can talk about, or we can propose that this makes sense in the context of the Christian worldview, and I'll just say that simplistically.
Sure.
For me, as someone who engages in these kinds of conversations, I'm just so uncomfortable with the Christian narrative in its entirety. To just simply refer to theism philosophically brings up, for me, the myriad of issues that the corpus of Christianity presents, and I'm so distracted by that when we have these kinds of conversations, because it's like you just, and it's the same with the Christian view. They're so frustrated and distracted by the atheist, or you could say that whatever that one may describe that to be, the atheist worldview. And some of their simplistic responses to the Christian worldview, which I've seen time and again. So I'm very distracted by the bigger debate, and like I said, I don't want us to just dive into that, and because we could talk for 100 hours on that. So I just feel like the theist response is too simplistic because of the broader conversation and the broader issues. And one thing I would also say is that I think people are less accepting of simple solutions to things, because I think they can be fairly dismissive. It's like we look at this, it's like, oh, okay, I mean, clearly this is a part of God's sovereign plan here. I might just reference John Piper for a moment there. This is all about the sovereignty of God and his predestined work in the world, and how this, the purpose of this is to glorify God, for example. I mean, he might say something like that. I'm sure you've heard it. So I'm just conscious of giving a simplistic explanation. I think the honest explanation would be to say, I don't know, but hey, let's have a look at what the experts say on this matter, which would cause me to read further, if I was very much interested in it. But I think the cool thing about being in, I guess a debater or a conversationalist in this sphere, is that every one of these topics gives you another little notch on the belt, something to draw from. And I think this is really relevant because it speaks to the broader conversation of consciousness, which is something everyone's very, very interested in. So that's kind of my response there.
So one of the things you mentioned is in talking about simplicity, and it's interesting because like so many of these terms have myriad of contexts in which we could use them, where it's like, what do you mean, right? And one of the things that I've run into that I find interesting, and honestly, the way I'm kind of approaching this conversation is I'm just trying to kind of frame like, what's the best way to explore this even, right? Because it is kind of one of those hypotheticals that's a little bit hard to kind of process. And I've run into this quite a bit where people, it's like they either like simplicity is like the one goal in their argument, or it's like, if it's too simple, it can't be true. And one of the things you hear a lot about when we talk about simplicity is Occam's razor, right? And I want to talk about that just a little bit and just kind of maybe try to establish like how we understand that, because I think sometimes people come at it in a really oversimplistic way, which is kind of ironic. I'm not saying anyone here is doing that, but just as we're talking about simplicity, often what I hear people say when they're describing Occam's razor is they just say like the simplest explanation is the best, or they'll even go so far as to say the simplest explanation has to be true, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing we would probably all agree that second statement is overstepping the bounds of like really what that's for. But even to say it's the best, it's not that it's the best in the sense of like, this is now my explanation for everything, and I don't need to look at incoming data, right? It's the best because it's the easiest to then continue to look at and continue to examine and understand, and then take incoming data and say, okay, I have a simple explanation. Does this data fit? And then put that in there, modify it a little bit. Maybe the explanation's a little more complicated now. That's a better way to work. It's a better methodology than I have this really complex thing and now I'm going to put one more thing into it to start with, right? But I think sometimes people take it from a methodology into this kind of almost metaphysical thing, and I don't really understand why they do that. But does that make sense? Like kind of trying to put that in proper context of like when simplicity is helpful and when it's not.
Yeah, I actually wanted to make a clarification on like the nature of simplicity and how it's being used in this conversation. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing from the philosophy of science, and there's been a lot of work. In fact, I recommend there's a paper called Systematizing the Theoretical Virtues that I really recommend. And you'll see a lot of scholars, think of like Oppie, Swinburne, we can apply the principles from the philosophy of science to the philosophy of religion and to metaphysics as a whole, like in light of their theoretical virtues. And when we talk about simplicity, you're spot on. Simplicity alone doesn't cut it. That's why I mentioned these theoretical virtues, because simplicity is sort of kind of like Eric Hernandez would say, a tiebreaker, all things being equal. And so simplicity, we're not going off simplicity alone. We're looking at, does it also have the causal adequacy to bring about the phenomena in need of explanation? Is it internally consistent? Is it coherent? Does it go off other warranted beliefs? Does it have the explanatory power, the explanatory depth? Does it unify this explanation with multiple explanations without having to tack on ad hoc theoretical content to solve isolated problems in the theory? So we want to make sure we clarify that we're not going off simplicity alone. We're going off, everything in light of its theoretical virtues. The only way we would apply specifically to simplicity is if we have two competing explanations for a phenomena that are equal in explanatory power, depth, scope, causal adequacy, all these different things. Then the simplest of the two would be more favorable. And so that's the only instance in which, we go off simplicity alone. So just to clarify.
Yeah, I like that, because I feel like it provides a lot of clarity for what you are and are not saying. And I think a lot of times when people present stuff like this, it's just, simplicity, ergo I win, or that's too simple, that doesn't work for me, so I just wanted to clarify, and I think that really helps to just kind of put out there what you're saying, what you're not saying, so that we can try to then have more of that constructive kind of back and forth conversation.
And so, and just real quick, the way this would sort of apply to like metaphysics and the philosophy of religion is you think of theism and metaphysical naturalism as two competing hypotheses to explain the nature and phenomena in reality. And so there's a lot of scholars, that will use these theoretical virtues, and like Oppie will argue that it's more favorable for metaphysical naturalism. And then you have, people like Swinburne, even to a certain extent Rasmussen, that will argue that no, it's more favorable towards theism. So that's sort of a way you can apply it to metaphysics also.
Okay. I like what you said, Travis, about all the different rock formations, the formation of the planet, the formation of the atmosphere,
Sure.
before you could even get into this stuff. And I like to think of the Earth as like a fishbowl. It's just inside out. The bottom of our fishbowl is the planet, but then our water is the atmosphere, and it's just attracted to the rock from gravity. But we're definitely in a fishbowl, and without that atmosphere, then none of this stuff could be happening. So yeah, all that is compelling in terms of, we wouldn't even be having these chemicals and protein shapes without that fishbowl.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, like, when you look at other, like, Venus is a fishbowl and Saturn is a fishbowl, but just drastically different. Does that make you wonder about the fine tuning, or do you think there's a reason for that, or how do you see that?
So here's the thing, because the fine tuning is actually, it's kind of like the problem of evil. There's a family of arguments within the fine tuning. The fine tuning argument, and in answer to your question, even like with, the normal fine tuning, no, that wouldn't challenge like my conception of it. And we can get into that. But I look at it as, you have all this cosmic fine tuning, of these heavy elements that build up, and the precision in that, and then you have this local fine tuning, and you'll notice it keeps going into even the chemical reactions, and then the biochemical processes that bring about embodied, conscious, self-aware moral agents. And so I kind of look at the fine tuning as being cumulative for the purpose of embodied moral agents, like ourselves, that can exist on a rocky planet to make morally relevant decisions. And when you look at the nature of like Venus and everything, you'll notice a lot of the, conditions on Venus are necessary for advanced life here on Earth. And so my inclination for the fine tuning is being geared towards embodied moral agents. Although granted, that's not really the conversation at hand. We're talking about like these organisms. So
the reason why I brought that up was because I was thinking that maybe science I should say secular science and theism might agree that all these steps had to take place before we could be here. And whether that's a theistic framework of self-aware moral agents, or whether it's a secular, saying animals that happen to think of this thing morality. But we wouldn't even be here. And so this idea of some sort of fishbowls existing first that we call planets, I think that ties into it, because that's the framework, or that's the foundation before you can even have these chemicals that are moving around. Would you say that simple organisms that start by avoiding danger and moving towards resources and regulating its temperature and replicating, would you say that's one of the first stages, or first necessary stages before you could get to self-aware moral agents?
I think it's part of the process. So, and I don't know if this is kind of where you're going with it, but as far as theism goes, I'm sort of a mix between an evolutionary creationist and an old earth creationist. And so I look at, the natural history of life, and I would see it as, God creates through long epochs of time. And, you start with like simple celled, or we could even start with Luca, the first, last
universal common ancestor.
Yeah. And so, and and then single-celled organisms. And here's actually an interesting phenomena that I think is really interesting. And this can even be seen with like sulfate-reducing bacteria. These microorganisms from the early Earth, interestingly, paved the way for more advanced life in very unique ways, and even had the organisms themselves had an effect on the oxygenation and events and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, our atmosphere was much different. until certain life forms converted the atmosphere because of their,
Yeah.
you want to say digestion process or whatever process that was.
Right.
James, want to go back to you because I think we've all talked the longest for a while.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So I like the Venus example. I feel like that opens up a few avenues for us to go down there, Richard. I don't know if any of you are into like long distance hiking. I think Richard, perhaps given your background, you may have experienced something like that. But I did a 2 week. Actually, it turned into a 10-day hike because I'm amazing. A 10-day hike. It's called the Great Southwest Walk, which is just south of Melbourne. So it's 250 k's, and one only has to do something like that. For example, I did a 30-kilometer beach stretch one day, and I seriously injured my calf muscle, and I had about 10 kilometers to go. And it was getting dark. So for the remainder of hike, I hiked in the dark, and then I had to go inland to this lake. And unfortunately, I had to go right around the lake to get to the campsite. But one only needs to experience something like that to realize that the world that we know it is not fine tuned for me. so I would say that. So in terms of being a fishbowl, not like Venus, but like Earth. Certainly not fine tuned. It might feel fine tuned now with my air conditioner and my collection of books, which I don't display in that. My TV and the kangaroo picture I have on the wall over there. But I completely dismiss fine tuning as an argument towards there being a God. So that's kind of where I'm at with that process here. I don't really have much to say. We've talked about a lot, so it's difficult to go into every response. And to be honest, it's now 4 a.m.,
absolutely.
so I can't remember everything that was discussed. But
yeah,
sure. I would just say, like, really briefly on the fine tuning, because this is sort of a common objection you would hear from certain audiences, with regards to, well, why can't I, hike, up higher without injuries, and why can't, you look at, why do these, like, think about hurricanes, like in the destruction, because what that would really open the door up to is, what's known as natural evils. I think that would be sort of the like a short, maybe a steel man of kind of where you were going with it. But basically the fine tuning, including the local fine tuning and everything, it's being argued that we can exist on a rocky planet to make morally relevant decisions and come to know and love God, love our fellow human beings, stuff like that. It's not really an argument that, we should be able to hike the highest mountain, or, exist in space, live underwater, all these different things, so that's not really what the argument is trying to entail, if that makes any sense.
yeah, sure. And I recognize that my my response there was somewhat of a straw man. But I think straw mans are helpful to illustrate a point. So one thing I always say is, just because something's fallacious doesn't mean it can't point to somewhat of a valid conclusion. And both sides use those. But you just have to choose which one you would implement.
We're a forgiving bunch here.
What's that? Sorry.
So we're a forgiving bunch here. So
yeah,
we're good with it.
Oh, for sure. Look, I would again say I recognize we're 50 minutes in, but in terms of where I sit with this debate, it's something where I need to do more research. I'm not, and one of the things I don't want to do in a juvenile way is argue for naturalism, because it's just not my area of expertise. It isn't. So I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to say, "Hey, I'm an atheist and I'm defending naturalism here," because
I'm the
that's
same
what
way.
atheists. Yeah, because that's what atheists do. But it does intrigue me, and it does cause me to reflect, philosophically or theologically,
Yeah.
about this debate. So about the topic, it's really interesting, and I think one of the really interesting things about it is you do go through that process of prescribing these, prescribing perhaps intentionality and looking for consciousness. And I guess that's what's really exciting about a topic like this, is observing not only the scientific data on this, but being mindful of yourself, as some of the things Joshua was alluding to prior to this debate and within this conversation.
All right. I'm gonna.
Sorry, Heaven.
I'm gonna hand it over to Joshua, but I just wanted to bring up one thing. I think after Joshua says, and Joshua might even want to start off with this. I'm going to ask everybody to say their story in terms of how this simple-celled organisms that just do those basic activities, how it fits into their story, whether it's a natural story or a theistic story. It seems to be one stage that's important for how we see the world. And then if we list those steps, and obviously you don't have to do all of them, but if we list those major themes, that can even give us more topics for future discussions. But before we start that, unless Joshua wants to be the first, I'm just going to pass it off to Joshua and let him say what he wants.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this debate is that you found a good example that ties into, a number of different things. So not only is this that question about whether, we're talking about theism or atheism as the best explanation, it also ties into questions about consciousness and into questions about whether or not the soul exists, what consciousness and mind and brain have to do with each other. So there are a lot of different kind of moving parts to this. So on the one hand, it's kind of this like wild out there hypothetical kind of question to throw at something and say, not only do we know that these organisms exist, but then if we continue to, let's say, discover that there's more things that they do that we usually would say correspond to our understanding of consciousness, what does that tell us, right? So there's a lot there, I think, to kind of unpack. And I think one of the ways that I would look at this is just saying, it seems to me that when we're talking about an organism like that, we're talking about a level of consciousness that's very different from our own. So it is hard to understand. We're also talking about, is there a sense of us being unique compared to that? Like, I think there is, right? We're able to have conversations like this where those organisms do not. And then you have the questions around, okay, does this fit within a worldview where you have a progression of beings that kind of move forward in time and get more complex? I think it does, right? Does it fit within a worldview where you have God creating things purposefully? I think it does, right? That's where it gets kind of interesting is like, okay, well, big picture, at least these both are somewhat compatible, but what does that actually tell us, right? So I think maybe the one thing I would do in maybe setting a kind of a boundary on how far this conversation could go, if we continued to progress what those simple organisms can do further into the things that we usually think of as consciousness, how far does that go before we start to say, are we really unique, right? And that can be looked at both from a biological perspective and psychological perspective. It can also be looked at from a biblical theological perspective. And for me, one of the places where that kind of intersects is that question of what does it mean to be made in the image of God, right? And this is where some of that ancient Near Eastern versus kind of modern, look at things, I think maybe helps to separate those things out a little bit, where I don't have to look at something and say, okay, the image of God is self-consciousness, or the image of God is conscience, or the image of God is creativity, or some property of human beings that human beings have that sets us apart from animals. I don't really have to do that biblically, because I don't think that's what the Bible is actually talking about. When I read in Genesis and I look at scholarship and I try to understand the terms that are being used there, what I see is that humanity was created with a specific role, function, purpose, identity, right, to represent God in the world, to essentially be children of God in a sense. And that those properties that we talk about are things that can enable that, in the same way that we might talk about our brain states being something that can enable us to then have these conversations where, if I have a head injury, like, it's not too likely that I'm just going to keep going at the same level, operating in exactly the same way. They're definitely related. My consciousness, my ability to think, and my physical brain, right? Those are definitely related, but are they the same thing, right? In this case, when I look at drawing that out to that boundary and saying, like, what if those simple organisms can do everything that we do in terms of consciousness? It doesn't bother me, because I look at something like the image of God being what makes us unique as something completely different than the properties that we have that we talk about, even though those properties can enable us to fulfill that function or role. Something to kind of, I guess that adds a lot to that could be a rabbit trail, but I think maybe it helps to kind of draw some of those things out, because sometimes we get into this thing of thinking, wow, like, what happens when someone's in a coma? What happens when we're talking about the unborn? Like, how do we draw some of these distinctions? Are they made in the image of God? Theologically, those are conversations, right? And they're relevant to a conversation like this when we start to talk about what it means to be conscious.
So I like that. And so when you're talking about, and this is to Joshua, so when you're talking about the simple cell organisms and stuff, and them doing these activities, that does eventually play a part in humans and being in God's image. So it's an important part of that. Would you say that's sort of your like, if we do this thing where we all take turns talking about how that fits into our story, would you say that what you said is part of your answer, or would you want to be supposed to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's part of my answer, because I'm trying to figure out how to frame things and to understand the world when we're talking about these organisms and what it would mean if they're able to do certain things, right? So the baseline we're talking about, they can do, the things you described, but what if they could do this? What if they could do that? What if they could do that, right?
Right.
What does that mean? What how does that fit? That's a part of the frame that I bring to it, just from kind of a biblical perspective, as someone that is a Christian. That helps me to frame it in the story. So I think it can fit very well, honestly, within both a theistic and an atheistic framework. The question then becomes, can we try to discern which is more likely? Can we try to discern which has more explanatory power? All those kinds of questions.
All right, I'm going to pass it off to Travis. I wanted to bring up one thing that you said, Joshua, that reminded me of something that Cy Gart said. He's I guess everybody knows Cy Gart, apologist, scientist. Something he talked about just last week was that at some point these single cells began to behave as if, and here we are, applying, intentionality. But he said these cells began to think of themselves as part of a different organism. So like each of the cells in our body, we have, trillions and trillions. Hold on just a second. My family's talking. We have these trillions and trillions of our cells, but they don't think of themselves as a cell. They think of themselves as the essential part of the human body. So they're no longer thinking of, hey, I've got to keep replicating. They're thinking, I got to play my part in this thing. I'm going to be a fingernail, or I'm going to be a blood cell, and so he's saying that thinking of itself as something larger, even though they're not thinking, that could be part of your story as well. Because I call that in a different conversation I had with Travis. I think Travis was in there. I call that like the zealotry wiring, which I think that people have too. And so, plants, single cells can have this thing where they're no longer thinking about themselves or thinking about being part of something else, even though they're not thinking, they're behaving as if,
Sure.
I keep stumbling over that language because I have the same kind of questions about that intentionality that James was bringing to the table earlier. Is like, at what level are they actually thinking if they're in that situation? I don't know. Yeah.
And that's what cancer is. Cancer is when one of your cells who's supposed to be, I'm going to be part of the liver, says, nope, I'm going to just be my own thing. I'm no longer going to behave as if I'm part of this. I'm going to do my own thing. And if it replicates, and if the rest of the body doesn't kill it, then it becomes a tumor that thinks of itself as this collective thing, and it does its own thing until everything dies. But that zealotry wiring doesn't have to be good or bad. It's just it's definitely a dedication to being part of something larger. And so I think that could, either you could be a theist or an atheist and say, yeah, this fits into what I'm talking about. But I wanted to bring that up because I think that would be the next stage for living organisms, not to just be thinking of themselves, but to think of themselves as part of something and acting and behaving as if they're part of something larger.
Well,
Travis,
and you're definitely telling a kind of more of a meta story too than just focusing on the focus of this debate too, because a lot of your work is around trying to get people to cooperate in the ways that you're talking about. So that's interesting.
Travis, you want to take it from there, and then we'll go back to James.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting topic, question, one that I totally wasn't prepared for. So forgive me if I stumble over my words a little bit, because I'm just trying to piece it together kind of as we speak and go along of how it fits, and using a certain criteria. So I guess this is my take on the conversation, that we have this phenomenon, and what we mean with teleology is not that it's conscious and thinking of itself, but that it's moved towards its own good, the good of the organism, that it goes in that direction. And so there's in that aspect, there's an intentionality and aboutness to it, namely the good of the organism, towards its good. And from that, I think we can argue to the good, which is another name for God. But that's sort of a different topic. But the way I would kind of see this phenomena, I would look at, the ministry I volunteer with, Reasons to Believe. And so from that perspective, I think it would fit quite well, because, we have all this cosmic fine tuning that leads to the local fine tuning. Because, even like I was saying, the variations in the temperature control chemical reactions. We have the precision that even allows molecules to bond together. And of course, the fact that we should even have these processes at all, I think is going to be more favorable towards theism. And then I see it sort of as a progressive creationist, like RTB would argue for, that you have the origin of life that to me seems miraculous, and then you'll see these organisms develop into more advanced until you finally get to embodied moral agents who have the intelligence and capacity to make morally relevant decisions in a moral theater. You'll notice all these processes that go on contribute to morality, because it's only in a world with regular laws occurring in regular ways that we can know the consequences and effects of our moral choices and things of that sort. So I would see it fitting in quite well with theism. And then, I think it would offer an inference to the best explanation based on its theoretical virtues as a metaphysical theory too. So.
Okay. So then, James, if you're thinking about these, and you don't even have to have read any of the science or stuff, but, you see even now these organisms, doing these activities even without a brain or nervous system. How do you think all that fits in? And again, I'm like you. I'm not one of those things that says, naturalism is the answer and we can stop talking about it. But just in terms of how you see the world, is that like a stage that leads to us? Is it an important stage? Do you see it differently?
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, I would say that I do hold to the view of naturalism, but I don't like to argue for naturalism because I do such a bad job on it. One of the speaking from my story, I would say that one, and I know there's issues with it, etc. But I think having read the origin of species, by Darwin, that was incredibly boring and incredibly enlightening to me, because there's so much there that prompts thoughts in respect of our origin, as a good, I think, a good starting point in exploring the topic. One of the things that really blew my mind was going to, and if you ever get the opportunity to do it, if you're in Australia, go to Melbourne Museum and look at the collection of skulls that they have. They are absolutely profound, and they clearly, it's from, what's it called, from, let me just have a look at what it was. It is Darwin to DNA. That's the display, but it shows you this collection of skulls where you can see the development of the sapien species, and it just boggles the mind. So in terms of where this fits in terms of my perspective, and I guess the argument I would respect, it has to tie in with evolution for me. Not that I'm saying this is it. I'm not saying, but I'm also, again, uncomfortable with the idea of putting agency on this, without having some real hard evidence for that, personally. But it's a great conversation. The whole evolution versus theism debate, or naturalism versus theism. I love how they've changed it to naturalism. But yeah, it's going to be ongoing forever, and I think, unfortunately, and I'm going to be a little bit more harder in speech here. It's unfortunately that will continue because of the devastating effects of religious indoctrination on the world.
Okay, I'll go real quick and say how I think it kind of fits into the story, and then we can decide what to do. We're over an hour, but I also think about this, talking about how this fits into our story. It gives us other topics, for future discussions.
Oh, absolutely.
Speaking of what we were talking about, Sigard, about how at some point the cells began to think of themselves as something larger, and then what James was talking about how this was like the first stage before we began to get a little bit more complex, and then like the development of people in terms of the skeletal and the biology. There's that development in terms of how the organisms are behaving and acting, whether they're thinking or not. Which brings me to another book that I just yanked out of my shelf, called The Social Conquest of Earth by E.O. Wilson, who just recently passed away. But this book, Social Conquest of Earth, talks about how in biology, just over and over again, organisms do that, where they stop behaving and acting as one thing and start acting on behalf of something else, to the point where you get like ant colonies where most of the ants can't reproduce. And if one does inadvertently reproduce, the other ants rush in and kill it, and the offspring, because everything's behaving on the queen. Everything's behaving and acting on the queen or the colony. So I do think that these single cells, starting off just replicating and regulating temperature and all that's stage one. And then at some point, some organisms start working together and behaving for the well-being of other things, whether they think that or not. And I think that was a stage two. Like in game theory, I think that was a stage two, where things that cooperating were outcompeting selfish things. But then there's a problem with just cooperating. Just this idea of I'm going to cooperate just because I cooperate, that doesn't always work either, because a selfish organism could go into a village of cooperators and destroy everybody, because everybody else is forced to cooperate, but the selfish person is like, well, then you just keep cooperating with me, even though I'm taking everything. That's not your concern. You just cooperate. One selfish organism can wipe out, a whole, community of cooperators, because they won't stop him from taking advantage of them, which is why I call the zealotry the third stage in game theory, which is organisms that they will only take care of each other, and they see everything else as a threat, or at least they tend to see everything else as a threat. And in that case, an outsider coming in and not cooperating, they'll just get rid of them. And not only that, if a member of their own community doesn't cooperate at the level that they see fit, then they get rid of them too. So outsiders and violators get wiped away, and this way, and this fits into the book that I was just showing. In this way, a zealous community can really kick some butt on the evolutionary scale in the world, because they're working together, and they also punish their own if they don't do it. So then you're chemically induced over time to be a fierce cooperator or a fierce zealot for the cause. And again, this doesn't mean that everything has to be like that. Just that I think we have this wiring, and I think that's again, that gets to further and further stages of our development. So I do think that this simple cells behaving and acting in terms of just their own well-being, I do think that's the first stage before that we eventually get into that zealotry wiring, which is a whole other discussion. But in terms of my story, I think that's the first stage of those three stages I just talked about.
May I just add one minute?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm sure many of us are across it, and it's basic theology. But you guys heard of Roger E. Olson?
Mhm.
I have not. No.
Okay. Anyway, he was revolutionary in the evangelical field of I guess an introduction to theology, because he spoke about sources and norms for utilization in Christian thinking, and he considered what sources and norms for thinking in theology that Christians could use. So he came up with the structure of Scripture being the primary. I'm going to be real cheeky here. The Scripture being the primary source of which Christians should utilize and reference for thinking and for argument and to be persuasive. And then he had some secondary sources, and those were tradition, reason, experience, and and he added experience. Now, one of the
That
things
sounds very Wesleyan of him.
Yeah, sure. And perhaps you referenced it, but one of the things I'm reflective of when I think of that. Actually, there's one more he added in, and it was, so there were four. The secondary sources, and it was scientific thinking. But one of the things I'd just simply like to say is that Olson was oh so convenient for the Christian worldview and framework, in the sense that he tried to incorporate everything, in the thinking world and the philosophical world and the scientific world. But I just simply like to say in a very kind manner that I just think that Christians should just stick to their field, and that's simply the Bible. So if they're going to be arguing for anything, that they should only be using that, and they shouldn't be, referring to science and going, "Oh, well, this confirms God." I mean, what I'm saying is the development of Christianity they're very good at just incorporating anything that suits their agenda, and I think that is dishonest, and
Could I ask a
is
clarifying
not
question?
helpful. Sure.
Go ahead, Travis.
Yeah, so when you say Christians should stick to their field, so I'm thinking, we have theologians that are theologians, but we also have this entire field, and I'm not speaking of apologetics as much as the philosophy of religion. I mean, we have philosophers who specialize in asking these questions. So I'm wondering, are you saying that Christians shouldn't argue for God in other fields? I'm not quite understanding what you mean by that.
What I mean by that is, I find it really dishonest for someone to say that I incorporate the evolutionary process as a part of my worldview that points to God. For me, it's the naturalistic worldview and the Christian worldview are entirely incompatible. So hold on, let me finish.
Okay.
So looking at naturalism and picking and choosing the points that you like out of it, and taking that as a part of the Christian narrative, and saying that, oh yeah, well, it's part of the old earth creation, and it all kind of works together towards my perspective. I don't like that.
Hey, wait just a second. As moderator, let me jump in. I just realized our next debate between the four of us, and I think it should be me versus James. I think it should be faithiest atheist versus honest atheist, because I have a completely different take than what the honest atheist just said. And again, I'll lie and he'll demand evidence, but between the two of us, I think we could have a good discussion, and then Travis and Joshua can be the moderators that do that. But then for this particular conversation, I was thinking, since we're at an hour and 20 minutes, maybe we can all say how we think this, and Joshua, you can go first, how we think this simple organisms, either not just either, but behaving as if they're avoiding danger, going towards energy, regulating themselves and replicating. We can say how that might be a problem for the other side. If they imagine how it could be a problem for the other side. And Joshua, if you want to, you can go first.
Oh man. If I'm honest, there are other things I would love to say first. If we have time, I can try to keep it brief.
Absolutely, because James did open up a can of worms. In fact,
I did, and I just wanted to say, I was going to say, could we just allow Travis to respond, because I'm sitting here smirking and he's going, "Oh my god." That's not fair.
We'll have Joshua go and then Travis go, and in each case, both of you can respond to the two cans of worms that James did. One is that Christians aren't being intellectually honest when they bring up science and all these other things outside of the Bible. And then the other one is the indoctrination, the religious indoctrination has caused, I guess, so much damage that it's not worth any, and this part I'm adding to it. But it seems like, James, you were saying that the indoctrination of religion is almost unforgivable or
No. What I'm saying is, it's placed the minds of human beings in prisons, which are very difficult to get out, and that's why we have different organizations now working towards assisting people to recover from that indoctrination, and that includes the general evangelical indoctrination too. Very harmful.
Okay, so hold on, Joshua, you go. Just don't forget. First of all, respond to the James can of worms, and then at the end, when you wrap it up for you, just say how you think what I was talking about earlier might be a problem, if you do think it is, and then Travis, you're going to go after Joshua.
Well, maybe I guess first I'll just say I'm not sure that it presents a problem for your side. I think it's more just a question of trying to examine, what maybe the best explanation is, and obviously part of the challenge for that is that the best explanation is something that on some level can be subjective, because it's the best explanation to the person that hears it and what their presuppositions are. So that can be a challenging thing to figure out as well, right? Because we are, each coming at this with a worldview that's been shaped by our experiences, has been shaped by what we've learned, and the story that we feel like we live in, and to try to place things that don't seem to fit in that and then try to make sense of it is a challenging thing for all of us to do. It's a psychologically hard thing to do. So I'll kind of concede. I don't think it causes a problem really necessarily for either side. I think the pushback I would have with what James said, it's actually really interesting, because I'm actually going to use the way that Richard was talking about this as part of that pushback. Is I'm not sure that it's the indoctrination of religion specifically, or of a specific religion, or anything else that's immediately the problem, so much as it is that sense of zealotry and indoctrination to begin with, because as we look at the history of humanity, there's been a lot of conflict. Some of it has been related to religion, some of it hasn't, right? Some of it has been driven by religion, some of it hasn't. We do see, I think, a trend where a lot of it is related to religion over time, more so than to non-religious or to totally irreligious things, in the sense that people have been so religious over time that we've seen that a lot. But when we started to get into the 20th century and we start seeing the impact of philosophy like Nietzsche and nihilism and really kind of what he saw coming, right? Because I don't want to necessarily say that he's the problem, but what he saw coming was, this is where we're on the doorstep of, right? We are about to enter the bloodiest century. And, he may not have said this in quite these words, but he saw a lot of what happened in the 19th century or 20th century coming. And we saw multiple world wars. We saw all of a sudden this idea of being able to use violence and the zealotry now becoming very expressly anti-religious in certain cases as well. So I don't think it's fair to just classify that as a religious problem. I think it's more complicated than that, and we're talking about maybe two different axes on a matrices that often will correspond with each other. But it would be something interesting to explore. The other one was whether Christians can use the Bible or other things. And I guess that depends on what you think Christians are. If we're people that experience the world around us and try to process that data and do that professionally as a scientist, why not use the science? If we're a person that's studying the Bible, of course we're going to, be trying to use the Bible. We're trying to use the means that we have in order to understand the world around us, in order to communicate effectively with people, in order to, in our case, commune with God. And so maybe it's too simplistic just to say you can't do that. I do think there is some question to ask in terms of what the utility of each of those approaches is, right? Because when we're talking about trying to prove God, who, it's like, can I have direct evidence of a God who's non-physical when the way that I see evidence is a physical, looking at physical things, like that gets kind of complicated, right? I do think we can have those conversations, the epistemology of that. But I don't know that I would bifurcate it so much as James did.
Okay, Travis, you can do the same thing. Just that wrap up. You don't have to do the wrap up first or last, and then respond to the things James said.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and do the wrap up first. So I think this brings up actually, because we look at the fine tuning and everything, but it also brings up this interesting idea of teleology. Is there teleology within biological systems? Is there a good that the organisms are goal directed towards, to move towards their own good? And so it seems that we kind of have to use this language of teleology to even describe the process. So I would of course argue that I think teleology is more plausible, again, not deductively, but more plausibly true, given theism, or an intelligence and intentionality behind the laws and processes in question. And so applying the theoretical, and this is where I would kind of disagree with Joshua about the subjectivity of it, because in the philosophy of science, that's why, that's a big reason why we use these theoretical virtues. Like, so we have this phenomenon and there's two competing hypotheses or theories, which of the two is going to be the most simple, that at the same time will unify the points of explanation, include other data in question. Can it incorporate it? Does it have the causal adequacy to bring it about? Because that's another thing we really need to ask on something like metaphysical naturalism, is not just why we have these processes, but that what would cause it to be geared in such a way that it is. So I do think it would be more favorable on theism, but I do want to clarify that my argument is purely abductive, not deductive, or even probabilistically inductive. It's abductive. I think it's more plausible given something like theism. In regards to what James said, I was a little taken back at the something like that. It's not something I'm really used to hearing with like a lot of the people I have discussions with. But I would say first, yeah, it's honest. Everyone's certainly welcome to their view. So number one, it kind of presupposes that biological evolution is in favor of naturalism, and we didn't really hear any argument as to why it's better explained by naturalism. And then I would say that there's also, within the philosophy of religion, the way, a lot of the top philosophers are looking at, things like that is you have two competing grand metaphysical theories of ultimate reality, something akin to theism or metaphysical naturalism. And so, they're in dialogue with one another on what's going to better explain. And you'll even hear like Bayesian formulation. It's kind of taking the dialect is kind of on Bayesian and, like an abductive inference to the best explanation of what, the nature of ultimate reality would be. And so that's a conversation that certainly needs to take place and, is taking place, I think, with slow but genuine progress in the philosophy of religion. And I would, finally, I would say that, if that's true, we would have to say that prominent philosophers of science and philosophers of religion, like Richard Swinburne and people like that, are being dishonest. We would have to say that someone like Francis Collins, who's one of the leading retired, but was one of the leading evolutionary biologists, in the U.S. That ran the National Institutes of Health. I mean, that's certainly a drastic length that I'm not willing to say that someone like Richard Swinburne and Francis Collins and people like that are being dishonest. And so that's all I got.
Can I respond, Richard? You're muted, Richard.
Sorry, I was on mute. James, I'm going to turn it over to you to do your wrap up and to follow up on however else you want to follow up to what they just said, and then you can just wrap up the original topic of the show.
Okay, I might not just do such a good job in the wrapping up, but look, my response is just really simple. I simply say I open the can of worms because I intentionally, and I know it was relatively simplistic, but I would simply just add to it by causing you to maybe think a little bit more about it, is that two mutually exclusive claims. You should recognize that when there's two mutually exclusive claims, to co-opt them for the purpose of the same argument is not a logical way of thinking. And I in some sense, I just wanted to challenge you guys and to think honestly about that. We have the narrative of evolution, which is actually backed scientifically, and then we have the narrative of theism, which is not. And I think those two things are mutually exclusive, and they are incompatible. Think more of that on that, and ask yourself: am I actually being honest here in my worldview, etc.? And yeah, that's all I'll say on that. But I also, I'm going to wrap up the show. But yeah, I'd just like to thank Joshua for being here today. It's been really good to have a conversation with you. Travis, I've actually been, like I said to you in chat prior to the conversation, was really looking forward to having a debate with yourself. And I think it's been good. I think me versus you could be a really interesting debate. I think we would both come and prep to the nines there. And Richard, it's been great to be on the show with you as well. Thanks for coming on. And to all of our audience, thank you for being here today. Your support of the channel is much appreciated. If you'd like to subscribe to our channel and like and share this video on your social media platforms, that would do a lot for the channel. And I think at the moment, we're going to be pushing towards 1,000 subscribers. So I think that's probably a bit of a goal, which all of us would celebrate. So if you can subscribe to our channel and get your friends and family to do that, that would be awesome. And again, thanks for being here. And Richard, anything else to add to that?
I was just going to add, just as a show note, when we were talking about teleology and biology, I for a minute panicked that one of the newer apologists out there named Seth Hart just wrote an article about teleology and biology for anybody who's interested in another apologist, scientifically inclined apologist. And at the very beginning of the show, I said, I mentioned a guy named Seth Grant, and for a minute I was like, are there two Seth Grant's, but it's Seth Grant that I was talking about at University of Edinburgh that talks about protein shapes and chemicals, making these simple organisms behave in certain ways. And then Seth Hart is the apologist / scientist who has the new article on teleology and biology. That was my final show note, Travis, if you want to take it from there.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick to kind of follow up with that, is that last month around the 1st of January, I actually did a one-on-one discussion with Seth Hart here on the channel where we went over and kind of dialogued about his work. So if anyone wants to check that out, you can find it here on the videos. And so with that, I think we are going to go ahead and sign off. So to everyone out there, take care until next time.
Bye.
See you guys.